thank you so much for joining us, Tim Ferriss. It's really a pleasure to have
My
you
pleasure.
on the Ledger. And we were introduced through Kevin Rose as you were starting your NFT project, and I thought maybe we'd get to chat before you launched the epic CockPunch. But yeah, but you were obviously both busy launching and doing some traveling. So I thought, okay, well, let's catch up after then. That might even be more interesting.
Yeah,
So I
totally.
guess,
It might be.
first question, how the hell is it? How is time in Web3, and is it, energy draining or energy gaining?
It is energy gaining for me at this point, and it has been for a while now. And I think that's in part because I set the rules up and the parameters and the constraints in such a way that I would avoid, to the extent possible, some of the pitfalls, some of the areas where you might get stuck in the mud or the sand. There have been points, certainly, that have been challenging, and Web3, specifically within Web3 NFT land, can be a full contact sport. So I think you just need to be prepared for that. Fortunately, having launched quite a few things in the last, let's just call it 15 years, I've developed some thickening of the skin. So I can handle that. And I also expect it on some level. I expect anything that I do, if I've actually stepped out of my comfort zone and tried to do something original, to probably divide the audience on one or more levels. So since I expect it, I think it has less potential to damage or stymie me. But there have definitely been a few points, especially immediately following the reveal. So the mint was on a Wednesday, the reveal was on a Friday. And there's definitely a point where I was subjected, not for the first time, because I know a lot of people in finance, but in this capacity involving art, narrative, and other things, to be subjected to some of the day trader psychology of, let's just call it maybe the mob of, say, certain people who are flipping, which I think serves a role in the ecosystem, but I'd never had to contend with the yelling and screaming associated
I was
with
pretty
it.
surprised because I thought you were pretty clear that this wasn't for the flippers. And
Very
from
clear.
my perspective, I was surprised because from my perspective, well, maybe we should back up just a bit for the audience. They might I've got the context, but let's assume the audience has less context. What is it that you have done in the world of Web3 over the past month?
Yeah, in the past month, I mean, it seems like kind of dog years, right? It seems like a full tour of duty at this point. But in the last month, I launched a project that I've been working on for the last 6 to 12 months, at least 6, probably closer to 12, which is an emergent long fiction project, which requires a little bit of explanation, but it's not a profile pick project. I don't view it that way. It's really an attempt to develop and exercise new creative muscles for me as an adult that I used a lot in my adolescence. So the D&D muscles, the fantasy muscles, the fiction writing muscles, and also the art muscles. So I was an illustrator for a long time. I paid part of my way through college with that and wanted to be a comic book penciler for probably between 10 and 15 years and took it really seriously. So I wanted to get back into engaging with both of those spheres and trying to combine them. And since I've been talking with Kevin Rose about Web3 and NFTs for a very long time now, at least in NFT timeline, I thought that combining all of those elements would be an interesting way to hold myself accountable and force myself to ship, force myself to publish. And it worked. And I wanted to also make it as, on some levels, as absurd and surreal and funny as possible. And that's not just because it amused me, although that is part of the energy gaining. That was definitely a parameter that I set up front, like joy and fun. If I start to take it too seriously or myself too seriously, we've taken a detour in the wrong direction. And maybe that's a design flaw and I need to revisit some design parameters, or it could be something else. Separately, it's a way to immunize myself somewhat against being too precious and not taking risks, right? As soon as you start to become overly protective of something, to take it very seriously. And at that point, you, I think, get very tentative with taking risks. And I wanted to feel free. That was kind of the whole point, to take big creative risks. So by calling something CockPunch, and there are reasons for that name, these are sort of anthropomorphized roosters who fight, and there are different greater houses and so on. You check a lot of boxes at the same time. And so that then minted early December 2022. And at this point, we're about a month out as we record this.
So what's that journey been like? I want to ask you more about the art. I don't want to talk about the floor price. That's let's talk about that in a year. I'm curious for you
Can I
personally.
just actually punctuate something for you?
Please.
And that is, I think what you just said is important. And that is like, let's look at it in a year. The time horizons for most people engaged in this space are so short. They're like the attention span of an insect. And that does not compound into good long-term outcomes or projects, in my opinion. So I just want to underscore what you said, which is things move up and down. That's true with so many things in life. There are cycles. There's also kind of boom and bust, hype and FUD cycles. All of these things apply to so many different classes of not just assets, but the human experience. To look at something day in and day out, unless that is your job and you feel like you have a competitive advantage to be a day trader who operates in those timeframes, is just sort of psychological suicide as far as I'm concerned. So didn't mean to interrupt.
Imagine what it would have been like to evaluate, Dungeons and Dragons or The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy after 30 days. We have no idea. Or The Alchemist.
The Alchemist was turned down by a bunch of publishers. Initially had something like 500 copies, and Paulo Coelho was trying to sell them out, effectively out of the trunk of his car. And only much later did it find its stride. That's also true for many book examples I can think of that took a reasonable period of time to find their stride, including my first book. Didn't happen overnight.
Yeah. And I think, first of all, you don't need to defend either the name or the concept with me. For years, I've described my aesthetic as a large amount of talent spent on something asinine. And, the fastest way sort of to my heart is to not take yourself too seriously. So you've checked the boxes. So thank you for that. But I'm curious for you personally,
Yeah, sure.
You're a writer, but you're a nonfiction writer. And you have the opportunity here to create fiction. Also, you're known for many things, but not known as an illustrator. And how much of this for you was, I really want to understand firsthand this, Web3 and NFT world, which I'm sure was a big part of it, but also how much of it was just artists are lucky they get to do art all day. And like you said, you wanted to sort of force yourself to be able to do that on a personal level. What's the mix there?
Yeah, the mix isn't, I would say, much of a mix, because I felt like I had a basic understanding of Web3 and some of the underlying technologies to the extent that a non-engineer would be able to understand some of the mechanics and just the flow of, say, product design within that type of space and the different frameworks and approaches that one might see, not just in NFT projects, but in DeFi and elsewhere. And that's why I had, in part, spent so much time on the sidelines, albeit I think in the front row, as a spectator. Right? I wanted to observe as much as possible, but that only takes you so far. And I was engaged. I was buying things. I was not so much selling. I haven't sold so much because that's of less interest to me, but I have engaged as a purchaser and as a spectator, as an investor, but not as a creator. What interested me was the ability to use Web3 to try to align incentives or create collective incentives. Not just that, but if I could create a collective incentive and maybe later experiment with things like token-gated commerce or access, which is something that is a non-trivial problem in publishing. You don't know who has bought your book. how do you communicate with the readers of your book? If you want to, say, give some type of reward or thank you to the readers of your book, how do you do that? If you have that overlaid on top of blockchain, and let's just say each book is a unique NFT, suddenly things become possible that weren't possible before. So I knew I wanted to play in that sandbox. For me, the drivers were, how do I shake off the cobwebs and really develop muscles that have atrophied and start to take creative risks that fuel me, and along the way, hopefully learn a lot. So I would say in starting this, what I wanted to learn is, how do you manage a large scale art project? How do you do art review? How do you develop, say, concept art and run through character development? What does that look like once you go from 2D to 3D, which we haven't really unveiled yet, but everything was done in 3D within Blender, and we used other tools as well, but predominantly Blender. So what do I need to understand about Blender if I want to, say, interact with a 3D artist and other coders effectively? So that has been tremendously fun. And then as I think of different things I can do or want to do potentially with this realm that has been created and these characters and these different clans, that has led me down, and this is very intentional, down all of these rabbit holes related to, and I'm not saying I'm going to do any of these things. I will probably not do the vast majority. Maybe I don't do any of them. But game design, animation, series, how do you take a static 3D character, let's just say effectively a digital figurine, and convert that into something that is posable? These are all super interesting questions, and they're not limited. In fact, they're not really Web3 native at all. They can be applied, but I think there is a tendency, and this goes for any given category you might find. Let's just say the label is Web 2 or the label is Web 3. There's a tendency, I think, for some, and this is not necessarily a bad thing, but to try to use only tools that are native to a particular playing field, technologically speaking. That could be Web 3. I think that's leaving a lot on the table. And so I am most interested in, how do I harness not just Web 2, but like much older technologies like imagination and storylines and narrative generated in the human mind. I know it's out of fashion maybe, but I come from the book world and I know how much of an impact fiction has had on my life. I am an avid reader of fiction and played D&D forever when I was a kid. So how can you borrow from these maybe antiquated, not so sexy modes of interacting and generating worlds and world building, and hopefully pour rocket fuel on that with the surgical use of new technology? That's how I've been thinking about it.
I think it's, let me tell you, my point of view is this for sure happens, right? And so that makes you a pioneer in doing that. And what I mean by this is that, fiction, gameplay, role play, D&D type of play certainly comes to this space. I think, generally gaming will be one of the biggest areas here. It's one of the most exciting, but also unexplored. And the way I think about it is, I remember the first time I played Zork in the in the 80s, and and then I look at video games today and I go, well, there we go. That's what 30 years is going to bring us, right? The difference between Zork and a video game of today. So you're creating a Zork. Thank you. It will have its place in the canon of history. And but also
a boy can dream. I like the idea.
Imagination. So I'm reading this book. I don't know if you've seen it, but it's called Speculative Communities. He references a book from the 80s called Imagined Communities, and it's amazing to me how relevant it is around the world of Web3. I mean, the reality is that truth is fiction, and we're sort of living in these imagined communities, right? If you're a moonbird holder and you live in the world of moonbirds, you're living in an imagined community. It's that simple. And so tell us about the world that you've created and what you've done to go with it, because there's the art and there are there are all of the characters, but the characters, I think one interesting thing is that the characters, you didn't know what the characters were when you started out, because the characters are generated, right, from work that you've made. And then you've also made a podcast, or a lore to go with it. So how are you using these different artistic elements to bring it to life, and what comes next?
So I'll answer the last part first. The what comes next is part of the Emergent E in the ELF, which is also kind of cutesy but fun for me because I love elves and was always a gray elf when I played D&D. And I started with first edition. I had some really early hardcovers and modules and so on.
I'm sorry if my mom is listening to this, but I kept my weed in the D&D box in the closet in high school, and I have a D&D history as well.
Yeah, it takes a village, all different strokes for different folks. So the emergent component leads me to not know what is coming next, although I've set certain conditions, and they're various from my perspective. And of course, I know more than people who are engaging with this realm that is not just being created by me, but sort of emerging from different inputs. The what's next is a question mark. And part of the what's next is me exploring all of these different possibilities in a very unconstrained way, because I have not laid out a roadmap. And from my perspective, and one could say this is just a rationalization, but it's not, because from my perspective, from the beginning, the intention was to preserve optionality and to also preserve surprise. So surprise, not just for the audience, but for me, is part of the payoff. It's a huge part of the payoff. And therefore, I haven't specced out any type of trajectory, and that's very deliberate. I would say all of the potential paths that I have on the map, literally and figuratively, because I draw a lot of this out in terms of directions that things could go, are very exciting and generative, meaning they open up even more avenues. Like each door I open enables the game to continue, from my perspective, in an interesting way. But that's all kind of abstract, or it could sound abstract. To me, it's very concrete. But let's come back to the first part. So the writing came first, and imagining the world came first. Then came deciding on the predominant houses or clans. Then came thinking about and starting with one of them, in this case, one called House Hallex, writing out a history that was blue sky, right? So coming up with a history of the clan. And I recognize some people might say, well, what kind of fiction is it if we don't have a main character to follow? This is not accidental. So it's not accidental that I've omitted a first-person narrative or even a third-person narrative at this point. That's not accidental. In part, I'll give you a sort of a flash of the cards, which is just to say, I want people to be able to put themselves in the position of player one. So right now we're dealing with concretizing the histories of these clans, because the histories, then once I had one down, I could begin to look at interdependencies, right? So interdependencies, old enmities, alliances, whether they're close and smooth or somewhat by necessity and forced and strained, etc. And once I had begun to piece those things together, I could then think about what these characters would look like. And that came reasonably quickly to me. And I'll tell you some of the thinking behind that. Some of the thinking behind that is I wanted to see in real life, that includes digital, but once this was released to the wild, how much people would begin to galvanize around their particular greater house, or their, let's say clan for simplicity, their clan. How much would people begin to coalesce around their clan and take it seriously, maybe begin to explore the potential background or lore of their own characters and so on. And I am in the business of running experiments, and there is no failed experiment. I mean, it's for me a means of testing and lobbing things out into the universe. So let's just say creating Twitter accounts for each of the clans. It turns out that may not be the smoothest way to engage people, although I did not want to have any official Discord for a host of reasons that I can explain. Also not accidental, and not just because I don't want to manage Discord, though that's true. I wanted to see what would happen outside of a centralized gathering place, if that makes sense. And then the podcast was a means of sharing that lore, which has not yet been shared in text, and that's deliberate because, and this might sound anachronistic perhaps, but we are storytelling. We are a storytelling and a meaning-making species. And writing is a relatively new invention. So for a very long time, and still in many cultures, it is oral transmission. And I wanted people to have to, if they want to take the world seriously, listen to each of these histories more than once. If they wanted to try to pick out the Easter eggs and connect dots, which, believe me, there are many Easter eggs and a lot of things that I've thought through that have yet to be revealed, they have to pay attention and listen twice. And that's a big ask of the audience. But my feeling is I'm accustomed to that, and I've done that before. I write 500 to 700 page books. Let's not forget. When I was told that the book would have to be under 200 pages, and I've violated that over and over again. So I'm always looking for kind of dogma in whichever area that I can violate as a test. And the podcast also was taking the uncertain and the new, which is this NFT project and the artwork and fiction, and combining it something which is the known and a strength of mine. I understand podcasts reasonably well. I mean, I've done hundreds and hundreds of recordings, and many of things have come of that. So I wanted to attempt to use that not just as a promotional channel, but an extra creative outlet for myself in working with voice actors, learning how to produce and actually go through an inflection, changing things from the written word to something that flows in spoken word, especially when I am an American and the voice actors I'm working with mostly are British. So those are a few of the reasons for why it has been presented, and at least been presented publicly in the way that people have seen. And it's gone really well. I mean, so far, I mean, the Mint went well, kind of sold out more or less immediately. And then there was a bunch of funny stuff and just kind of yelling and screaming that goes after every, seemingly comes after like every remotely successful project, a lot of that. And then that died down. And it seems with, every secondary transaction, the community is getting closer to the community that I would like to have.
Yeah,
over
that's
time.
What happens, right?
And
people
so
who don't
I'm very
want to be
happy
a part
with it.
sell out, and the right people come in.
And it's another constraint that I wanted to apply. And part of the reason for doing this project that I have not mentioned, but you just reminded me, was one of the primary drivers, is I had been looking for unconventional ways of raising funds for my foundation, which is a registered nonprofit foundation. And it, as your mushroom would indicate, has funded and continues to fund a lot of the groundbreaking research centers, scientists, collaborations that I think have been acted as a foundation for much of the psychedelic renaissance that we have seen in the last 5 years. So a lot of the research and the initial exploratory pilot studies at, say, Johns Hopkins and so on, the Saisei Foundation, which is my foundation, has been involved with. So I wanted to see how I could raise money for the foundation, but to do it in a way that did not involve me just calling rich friends and trying to convince them to provide money, which I can do, and I'm pretty good at it, but that's not interesting. It's not new. And I was looking for unconventional options where I could not only raise money for the foundation, but also hopefully provide a proof of concept that would encourage other people to experiment. That's always what I do. I try to prototype some test that, if successful, other people will build upon. And so the Mint ended up raising about $1.8 million. And I'm thinking of it in dollars because all of the primary sales immediately were converted to USD and then sent to the foundation. So yeah, thanks for the reminder. But that was one of the primary drivers.
First of all, I would love to detour on that for just 2 seconds because I'm personally interested in it. When you made the announcement that you were starting this foundation, I thought that's it's really an incredible thing to do. Ballsy on some level, not overly, but I mean in terms of like things to fund. That there are many to choose from, and you chose one that's certainly controversial to some people. At the same time, one that has probably been the most, this is my opinion, the most underfunded relative to the potential benefit it could have to humankind. Since since the 50s and 60s. Maybe thank you, Tim Leary. Maybe we shouldn't blame him. But I personally, I just find that I think it's important work personally. What's come of that foundation so far? What's come from that foundation?
Yeah, happy to talk about it. So the foundation, I personally started funding, and then the foundation a bit later, not that much later, research related to psychedelic compounds. I want to say 2015. So a lot has changed since 2015 and 2023. Quite a lot has changed in terms of public sentiment and also available capital. I mean, at the time, really, there were no for-profit psychedelic related companies. And that has certainly since changed. There are thousands now at this point. And I have very mixed feelings about the approaches and sort of IP obstructionist patent troll type behavior of some of these companies, especially when it comes to pre-existing patents that belong to nature, let's just say, and blocking manufacturing. But let's not detour there for now. The foundation has funded a lot of the initial research into the use of psilocybin for treatment-resistant depression and major depressive disorder. That was at Johns Hopkins Medical. And the primary investigator there was Roland Griffiths. We were able to first crowdfund that. So I had dedicated personal funding, but I wanted to gauge my audience and to see how much pushback, if any, I would receive. Not that it would change my decision, but I was curious to see what would happen. And so at the time, used a company called CrowdRise, which I think has since been acquired by GoFundMe. I want to say that. I could be getting that wrong. And the motivation behind that is very personal. I have addiction in my family. My aunt died of Percocet plus alcohol overdose. My uncle died of alcohol-induced cardiomyopathy. He was an alcoholic since he was a teenager. And my best friend growing up outside of my family died of an opioid, fentanyl in this case, overdose. And I also have treatment-resistant and major depressive disorder in my on both sides of my family, and I've experienced that. So I can say from a personal level, and there are significant risks that don't get discussed enough, I think. But if we put that caveat aside for a moment, I mean, personally, these compounds and the associated therapies, this therapeutic wrapper, have saved my life. I would not be here having this conversation with you if that had not entered my life, or if I had not entered those areas.
Or we could say there would be
no
CockPunch.
There would be no CockPunch. There would be no CockPunch. There would not be a lot of things. And for that reason, and having also seen on the underground so many results and looked at some of the older research also related to, say, alcoholism, which is now called alcohol use disorder. I'm sure that label will change, which has been resurrected in a sense by New York University. I wanted to engage very heavily. So it began with the depression. Then I was a founding funder of the first dedicated psychedelic research center, I want to say in the world, certainly in Europe, which was at Imperial College London with Robin Carhart Harris at the time and David Nutt and others. Then the foundation was part of the founding funding of the Johns Hopkins Center, which was a real watershed moment. So that was the first ever dedicated psychedelic research center in the United States. That includes in the 50s and 60s. And it ended up being multiple pages in the New York Times. It was on the cover of the New York Times and the cover of the science section. At the time, that was shocking. It was an unbelievable type of placement for anything involving psychedelics. That has since changed, and part of the goal in funding that center and also raising about half of the money. So I had my foundation's personal commitment, then I helped raise about half of the 17 million or 17.5 million that ultimately went to the center, was to encourage other people to explore funding. So I recognize that I don't have the most money, nor can I raise the most money in the world, but I do have a megaphone and I have a degree of credibility with certain circles. And the hope has always been that I can tip over a domino by going first. And if I don't, if I can demonstrate there's very little reputational risk, that other people will follow suit. And that happened. So other studies and other firsts would include the first psychedelic journalism fellowship, because there aren't enough good journalists covering this space, not just to cover the good, but to ferret out bad actors and to talk about risk factors and a million other things. So I was able to partner with Michael Pollan at and create this fellowship. So that's something the foundation did. Another first was the first Law and Policy Center. It's a project. It's called the Poplar Project at Harvard Law School at the Petrie Flom Center. And so if you go to SaiseiFoundation.org, Saisei is Saisei, foundation.org. That means rebirth in Japanese. I used to live in Japan. It means many things in Japanese. One is rebirth. So SaiseiFoundation.org, if you go to projects, you'll see a lot of these are uncrowded bets that I thought would be high leverage because they were a proof of concept. I wanted other people, other institutions, other countries to copy and improve upon, or to just use them as a starting point to build out more. So I'm really proud of what the foundation has done. And there have been a lot of incredible supporters. And I'm also standing on the shoulders of giants. I mean, there are many, many people who came before who were incredibly influential on the underground who will never get the credit that they deserve, because many of them have passed away and some of them are still on the underground, so they can't really speak publicly.
Yeah, well, and we can come back to Web3, and I have a couple of things I want to ask you, and I also want to be respectful of your time. But I did want to pause on it because personally I applaud you for you do have a megaphone, and you could have just stood up and said, let's all go to South America and take ayahuasca, but instead you're trying to build the canon of research and like you said, get to the bottom of it. What is it good for? Yeah. Who is it good for? What businesses should we be building on this? Which ones we shouldn't? How can we grow good actors? How can we grow bad actors? How can we really look at this, critically for the first time, instead of either, again, let's all go to South America and do ayahuasca because we're cool, or in my brother's time, let's just take shrooms and go see Judas Priest, or this is evil, stay away from it, it's horrible, don't talk about it, don't look at it, don't look over here, there's nothing to see. You're really going down this path of no, let's look rationally at this finally. Which I think is super important. So, thank you for demystifying that for some people. And I think there is a tie-in to me. I mean, you have dedicated the funds from CockPunch to this particular thing, but there's also this sort of fearlessness and an irreverence and a willingness to kind of stick your neck out there and go, let me try this, and if it works even somewhat, then other people please follow in my footsteps. When I first was explaining NFTs to Ben Adano, I said, listen, he's just a guy that has always built on the back of creativity. And the simplest way to get the point across was, anytime you give creative people a canvas, it's a matter of time before they blow you away. And I feel like you're exploring the canvas of NFTs. And I guess, I really, and again, in respect of your time, I just have a couple more things I wanted to ask you. And one is, how are you finding the fiction writing as opposed to the nonfiction that you've done so much of?
Nonfiction. Yeah. Happy to to dig into this. And I would like to say one thing before we move too far, which is the foundation funds predominantly early stage science that will hopefully lay the foundation for many different branching possibilities of higher level scientific exploration. And I mean, some of them are still using very advanced imaging and so on. But the foundation does a few other things. I'll just mention one here, which is because I have, and this is, a lot of people have done this. I'm not one of a kind here, but I've learned so much from lineages that are represented by traditional healers, whether it's in Mexico or in South America in various parts. The foundation also supports different projects and outfits like Amazon Conservation Team, ACT, which is headed up by Dr. Mark Plotkin, very famous ethnobotanist, his wife, and they are incredibly effective at not just protecting indigenous lands and securing federal protections in different countries, most notably, I would say, in Colombia, but certainly in other places. They're very, very good at preserving, let's call it, ethnobiological and ethnocultural knowledge from different tribes for those tribes to avoid things like biopiracy, or at least to mitigate against it. So there are funds that have gone to protect in the, say, Sibundoy Valley, these sacred gardens, which are unique for a couple of reasons. One of which is that they're entirely female run, which is actually quite unusual. You do find female healers at a, let's just say, a high level in the hierarchy in a few notable tribes. The Shipibo and the Maztecs come to mind. It's not that common, but in this particular case, I thought it was a very, for a whole host of reasons, a high leverage and very important project. So while I am exploring on one end of the spectrum the most advanced science that has ever been done on these compounds, at least some of it, I'm also trying to protect and preserve and further understand or propagate understanding of the traditional cultures who, through trial and error over hundreds of years or millennia, have allowed the world to experience some of these incredible plants and compounds. So I just wanted to make the point that I do think it's important to see the whole elephant, not to stretch the metaphor, but the entire parable of like 5 blind men all holding a different part of the elephant and thinking that the elephant is that thing. It's a snake. It's like a rat. It's this. Oh no, it's a wall. I think that both on the, if you overemphasize and focus exclusively on, say, the indigenous, or focus exclusively on the latest scientific, you can develop a certain myopia and blindness that is damaging to the whole. So I just wanted to say that. On the fiction side, I am loving writing fiction, because when you're a nonfiction writer, at least of the type that I suppose I am, you do incredibly long-term, in-depth research. Then you outline and blueprint, which is effectively like the architect creating the plans. And then after that point, there are creative decisions along the way in terms of how you might format a chapter. But from a content perspective, you know what's coming. It's carpentry on some level. With fiction, if you approach it in the way that I'm approaching it, and there are many ways to write fiction, and I'm a novice, I can make what comes out a surprise. And in that respect, you can spend more time dancing with the muse. And if something just pops out of nowhere, you can use that thing. Versus if it doesn't fit into an outline and a flow for a 700-page book that is due in 6 months, you don't have quite as much wiggle room. But since this is open-ended, since I did my best, and I think I set very clear expectations about what this is and would be and would not be, I have free reign to play in a way that I think has been, or I've thought of as being impossible up to this point. And I'm getting so much out of it. I'm having a blast.
My next question, you have an incredible set of crypto teachers. I've
Yeah.
listened to you learn about crypto from the likes of Naval Ravikant, Balaji, Kevin, etc. And and so as you said earlier, you've been kind of in and around this, and a curious mind, a spectator, an investor, a collector, for a while. But for you with this project, I'm curious, what's new here in your mind, right? What wouldn't have been possible without Web3? You did a crowd rise, once upon a time, and now you've done, something else. So, what are the elements that blockchain brings to this, and and how, what's the maximum you think you might be able to get out of that, out of the technology, the newness here?
Yeah, the newness. I mean, we could go into all sorts of nuances, but I think the crux element is ownership, right? If people buy a book, they don't own a unique asset. I hesitate to use the word asset because this is not financial advice. I dissuaded everyone who would read any fucking element of the FAQ not to buy this as an investment or view it as an investment. Pardon my French, I'm from Long Island. But I'll use it for simplicity's sake because it's just a term people will understand. So if you buy a book, uh, or you buy many different, whether it's a physical good or a digital good, you have no ownership, you have no title. And that can produce all sorts of issues. I mean, you can have sort of tragedy of the commons type situations, uh, both in real life, physical life, and digitally speaking. And so the ownership is the key piece. Now, ownership as a term isn't that interesting to me, but incentives are very interesting to me. So, can you use ownership to align incentives? And the answer, I think, is maybe, not always. And what I've observed is, I think in an unconstrained, completely decentralized environment with anonymity, the default is the worst of human nature. that's that's my conclusion. Like the default is Lord of the Flies, terrible behavior, and that's human nature. So I would say even if you want a trustless system that relies on code, uh, human nature is going to find a way to squeeze through the cracks in some fashion, whether it's obvious or very subtle and indirect. And for that reason, I've been watching the
Especially,
community.
by the way,
Yeah,
especially if there's money to be made, right? Because
especially if there's money to be made or lost, right? Like, look what happens. Like, what will people do to make $100 versus what will they do to avoid losing $100 versus what will they do to punish the world if they feel like they've had $100 taken away? And I've thought about these things for a very long time. I've studied them. I've read all of these books on behavioral economics, predictably irrational, a million others, including some more technical stuff. And I think as a participant with a megaphone who has some practice with community, I don't want to say building, community shaping, perhaps. Building and shaping. I think they're separate skill sets. Uh, I want to try to direct the current towards situations and communities where the better aspects, let's just say the more positive aspects of human nature, are rewarded. And that takes work. It doesn't just happen. It
it is
really does
incentives,
not
as you
just
said,
happen.
right? I mean, you've
Yeah.
got to establish.
Yeah.
You're building a community with incentives. At the end of the day, remember Robert
Yep.
Kinsel talking about building YouTube and realizing that it went from a village to a town to a city to a country, and it needed laws, which in some ways means incentives, right? If
Yep.
you do this thing, you get a slap on the wrist. You do this thing, you get a cookie.
Yeah. And I think in Web3, this is not true across the board, but there tends to be I think, narrow focus on financial incentive. And of course, that would be the case because you have the blockchain, you have this just you have this transparent ledger, and everybody can look at the scorecard. not just their scorecard, but multiple scorecards. And humans like to track such things because they are simple. It's kind of like, the guy looking for his lost keys under the lamp at night. And they're like, well, I thought you lost it over there. And he's like, yeah, but it's brighter over here. I think that whatever is obvious and quantifiable, it tends to have a gravitational pull. But what I've seen is, I think a lot of creators who focus on developing mechanics for fostering, say, loyalty through some type of financial incentive. And some of them are very interesting. I'm not ruling them out for myself, but they're kind of layer one. They're the most obvious to me. And so I would like to experiment with other means of reward, not just because I philosophically and morally think it's a good idea, but also because if you focus on the financial, you're going to attract people who focus on the financial. And that's not the community I want to build. I do not want to attract the transactional who are kind of low attention span, low loyalty. I want there to be other reasons that they engage. And I don't think that's naive, because I've operated in a bunch of worlds where there is no digital ownership. There is no title. So there is no financial incentive, but you can have other incentives. What remains to be seen is in Web3, at least let's just say the NFT world that we're discussing, once you have a financial incentive, does it crowd out everything else? Do people just become savage beasts because that incentive overpowers everything else? I don't think so automatically. I don't think that's true automatically, but you have to apply, in my feeling, not just a part of establishing good incentives is creating really positive constraints. So I'm thinking a lot about how you can use constraints, which might mean slowing down the rate of expansion or public exposure, to play the long game. If we're trying to run a really fascinating social experiment, which will be a tiny corner of the Web3 world that is hopefully very positive, where people can go to get recharged instead of just like swimming in the pool that everyone's pissed in. You really have to think about the kind of design parameters and what you will allow and what you will disallow, and what disallowing means, right? If there are rewards, there are consequently punishments, whether that's the absence of reward or some type of, exiling or banning or whatever it might be. This requires a lot of thought. So I'm enjoying that right now. I know that's a long answer, but hopefully people find part of that word salad.
I think it's actually really interesting and worth exploring. I think your question about, when there are financial incentives, does that crowd out everything else? Because, and I think you're right. Also, I agree with you, not necessarily, but I think that means it'll always be a part of it, right? I pay for my Soho House membership. It's not resellable. There's not a financial incentive for me to buy a Soho House membership. My incentives are actually all the opposite, right? Did I use enough to get the value? Did I visit enough houses this year to get the value? And if there was a financial incentive for selling it, I may have sold my Malibu membership by now, instead of simply letting it expire, right? Mm-hmm. But I think that, to your point, like, the incentives are probably whatever you give as rewards, right? If financial rewards are attainable, then people will certainly take those. But if you're giving other rewards, for me as a proof member, I really value, the daily kind of, espresso that they have, which is like an NFT market update. And that is not a financial reward at all, but it is a reward to me. It is a reward of membership. At the same time, if you're going to buy a proof membership at the price that they're at, then you would be absolutely justified in asking yourself, like, what am I getting? What is the value that I'm getting in return? And if you don't think you're going to get that many ETH in value out of the daily NFTs and the chatter on Discord, then you should ask yourself, okay, well, am I going to, do I stand a chance to make some money back on this thing? Right. So I think that it's somewhat natural, and it comes over time. And it is exactly why I said to you in the very beginning, let's talk in a year. because I think that
Yeah.
you will kind of set up that incentive system for your community. People who think your incentives suck will bail. People who think your incentives are awesome will stay or join, and then you'll hit some sort of an equilibrium. And I really think that's great, to be honest. The way that I look at this personally is that the internet that you and I have benefited from so much was this revolution of information. The fact that we can have this conversation is due to the internet. The fact we can share this conversation with other people at basically no cost is because of the internet. But that's a revolution of information that used to be behind gatekeepers and now is free. The blockchain brings us this revolution of value. What you're doing is and I love watching it, right? And that's why I say let's talk in a year, because you're going to be playing with the incentive systems in within your community, and you're using it as a creative platform, and you're using it as a platform to do good for a cause that you care about. So I think all of those things are totally valid for me personally, and I'm excited to watch them unfold. I think just to wrap up, I'd love to ask you about crypto broadly. You've had again some of the absolute best minds in the space on your show, and have the opportunity to have a conversation with them. And I'm curious what you think this future looks like. I think all of us think this is quite early. I'm here because I was there at the very beginning of the internet, and that was the fun part. And so I want to be here at the very beginning of this, assuming that this is also the fun part. And I love, thinking about what this looks like, not 30 days from now, not even 5 years from now, but, 10 years from now, 25 years from now, and even after I'm gone. What is the importance of crypto to you?
It's a big question, and I think it's probably above my pay grade in many, many capacities. But I will say that I do think digital ownership is here to stay. That is the most interesting piece for me. I do think distributed systems and decentralized marketplaces and so on are here to stay. However, I will say that if you were to take anyone listening to this and say, okay, active player in Web3, go grab 20 of your smartest friends who has never engaged with this and try to get them to the point where they're having fun being involved. That is a very big ask. I like to think that I'm reasonably smart, not the smartest. I mean, I probably am as dumb as I look, but I have a decent amount of experience testing new technologies, and people will probably look down their nose at me when I say this. It's a pain in the ass. It is a real pain in the ass for the most part to get to the point where you can engage in a meaningful way. And even if you engage in a meaningful way, there's a lot of bad behavior. There is a lot of bad behavior. And that can be outright fraud and illegal activity, but it can also just be very destructive or corrosive human behavior, which is protected by anonymity. So I would expect that digital ownership is here to stay, but that for this to onboard anything resembling a critical mass in the mainstream, which, by the way, should be an existential priority for anyone involved with the space, because if you have the majority of your net worth, or even a substantial amount of your net worth in assets that are tied to this, and you don't want it all to be destroyed through various regulatory actions. And trust me, if you think you're Jason Bourne, you're not, probably. So I would encourage you to not try to be Jason Bourne unless you've been doing this for a very long time, in which case I still can't advise that you do it. But having worked with a bunch of 3-letter acronyms in the past, I can tell you they're a lot smarter and much more seasoned and much more technical than you can imagine. I would say that I would anticipate if there is a there, and this is going to be adopted, there are going to be a few drivers of that. Number one will be services that allow some degree of protection against not just fraud, but bad behavior, being constantly exposed. If someone's experience of the internet is like being in the worst parts of Twitter, they're not going to use the internet. So I would say that services will certainly come about, and I understand the expression, trusted third parties or security holes and all of these various expressions that are common in Web3. I agree with that end. I think the majority of people would rather have Amazon have access to their purchase history than every person on the internet. So there will be modifications made. And if you don't want any of those modifications to be made, this stuff is not going to be adopted. If it's not going to be adopted, it's not necessarily going to get stamped out of existence. But if one of your primary reasons for being involved is that you're a true believer in whether it's, fill in the blank crypto, I'm not going to name names because people go fucking crazy. You should want broader adoption. What that means is institute, not just retail, but institutional, and probably at some point sovereign wealth, etc. And you just cannot have repeated FTXs. You just can't have that. So I do think digital ownership is a really important and transformative concept. I do think digital ownership in virtual spaces, I don't want to use the M word, but in virtual spaces is nearly inevitable, whether they're in closed or open systems, right? So we already see skins and various assets you can buy within a gaming environment. So I do think that the big question is, will anyone be properly incentivized and funded to develop something or anything that operates cross-platform? I don't know. TBD, right? Will there be something that is the equivalent of an open source project like WordPress, and so it began, that allows some degree of interoperability that produces a product that is more compelling than, say, a Meta? I don't know. It's going to be hard. It's not going to be easy. But I'm watching all of this. I think there are more open questions than answers. And I'll stop talking at that because I don't have a crystal ball. But there are there's a lot of house cleaning that needs to be done. And if let's just say the participants in Web3 are not willing to, in some capacity, self-govern and self-police, someone else is going to do it for you. So it's not a question of if you like either of those, do you want to opt out of both of those? You do not get to opt out of both. You get to choose one or the other.
I appreciate it. I'll save my opinion on it for the next.
No, I want to hear. No, tear it apart. I'm a newbie here. I want to. If any of my stuff doesn't hold water, you have such a broader experience with all of this. I'd love to hear your thoughts. I bet other people would too.
No, I think I completely agree with you that the experience lacks, right? And that's the fundamental of what you're getting at here. And that's, frankly, what our job is every day.
Yeah, totally.
Is to improve that user experience. And we have a long way to go. What I always say to people is, I remember very well when you didn't say, go to my website. You said, you took a deep breath first and you said, there's this thing called the web. And if you get a computer and you get a modem and you get a web browser and you get an ISP, then you can go to this thing called the web, and it's super slow. And as long as you don't mind that your we get kicked off the web when your roommate picks up the phone, what I mean? It was, that's what it was. And it was a joke.
Yeah.
Right. It was reasonable for a grown up to look at it and go, have you seen the TV? The fucking thing works. And so, but there was something else there. And I do remember also people telling me the internet will never work. The future is going to look a lot more like America Online, than this World Wide Web thing, because it's way too hard to use. And I remember people saying everyone will never have broadband, because that's crazy. And I remember people saying everyone will never have a smartphone. Like, that's for rich people. They'll never pay $500 for a smartphone. And so, to me, like, the technology, once technology is possible, it's inevitable. And I agree with your base thesis, which is, digital ownership is revolutionary. Right. We've spent all this time, again, for me in my head, the internet was this revolution of information. It used to be like, how much spectrum is there on FM? How many channels are there on TV, cable? How many videos can the video store stock? How many magazines can the magazine shop hold? Like, we were limited by those things. And if you didn't have access to those distribution channels, well, then fuck you. Right. And now, like, Tim Ferriss can sit wherever in the world he is, turn on his microphone and reach a global audience. And that is unfucking believable, right? Yeah. It's just like, imagine telling the 15-year-old me or you that was possible. Like, holy shit. When I was 15, I drove an hour to buy a magazine so I could mail order vinyl.
Yeah,
you know
totally.
What I mean? Like, the world has completely changed. And I think also the main thing is that, you're completely right. I think that certainly straight up scammers, but the reality is that FTX has zero to do with crypto, right? It's actually, there's nothing in.
Okay, go ahead.
No, like, the technical reality is, like, if I give you $50 and you tell me, yeah, I've got $50 of value, that's not crypto.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter what asset it's held in. It doesn't matter if it's held in dollars or cocks or Bitcoins. It's fake. If I give you $50 and you're like, yeah, sure, it's over there, and it's not, that is fundamentally not crypto. That's not digital ownership. That's actually the opposite of digital ownership, right? And so, that's like simply fraud. And so, yes, just like there was OneCoin once upon a time, which was this total, I mean, there was a BBC podcast about OneCoin, and it's, what you've got kind of the promise of number go up, which is exactly the thing that you're, disliking in the, why is everyone so, focused on number go up, right? And it's like that number go up is like in the human psyche, right? Oh my God, Vegas. And it's like conflating that with multi-level marketing. And that was called OneCoin, right? Actually, it was a scam. It was never liquid. It never existed. It was put your money in, the money never comes out. It was a money roach motel. And actually, crypto is magic money, right? It's if I put $50 in the bank, there's not $50 in the back with my name on it. But if I buy $50 in Bitcoin, there is actually $50 with my name on it. Right. And so it's denominated in Bitcoin, yes, but it could be denominated in dollars, and it's called USDC, or it could be, denominated in something else. But that is actually the magic. And so I'm just putting the two together, right? It's the concept of digital ownership with the concept of money, or the concept of ownership with CockPunch, or the concept of ownership with a concert ticket, or a digital fashion, as you said, in gaming, or a digital weapon in the game that I'm playing, or, those sorts of things. So, I mean, actually, I agree across the board. I think the user experience must improve. And that's like all I think about all day, every day at my job. Yeah. And we have such a long way to go. But my job, in fact, is to improve that user experience without ever leading people into an FTX world.
Yeah.
Right. And we had, artists come up to us at Art Basel and just say, like, look, I just want to say thank you, because I actually didn't understand the concept of self-custody.
Yeah.
But because some friend put me on Ledger, I actually didn't get wrecked when everyone else did. And now I understand. Right. And so it's that unwillingness to compromise on the self-custody and the security, because if not self-custody, why crypto? And then trying to drive toward this ease of use future, which is elusive, just like it was elusive on the internet in 1998. You know what I mean? Like, it was, we did before broadband, 10 years before the iPhone. Like, oh my God, why are we even doing this? Like, I've always say that, like, when the iPhone appeared, a whole bunch of us, especially when the iPhone dropped an app store, a whole bunch of us went, wait, that's not the web. But oh my God, this is what we've been waiting for. Like, there's a reason that we've been building, right? And so I think that day might actually still be 10 years away.
Yep.
6 years away, 8 years away. That ease of use that you're talking about, completely agree with you. But I think also though, and when you're getting to this and a lot of things you're saying, the stakes are just higher.
Yeah.
You're talking about value. You're talking about money. Look, the stakes were high if you were a record label or a movie company or a newspaper with the internet, right? But for the average individual, they weren't as high. But in the world of crypto and Web3, like De La Soul said, stakes are high for everybody, So anyway, that's my thoughts on it. It's a
I know. I'm so
diatribe.
happy to hear these thoughts, and I'm sure a lot of listeners are too. So, first of all, glad I asked and pushed it a little bit. Secondly, I want to maybe comment on just one piece, which is I would agree with you 100% that FTX doesn't necessarily, or maybe not at all, represent a technical failing of crypto as you are describing it if you have self-custody. However, if you take the perspective of, say, a macro hedge fund investor, I know that's probably a dirty word for a lot of people, but let's just say someone who looks at the interrelatedness and the secondary and tertiary effects of different things that might at first be a few hops away, but nonetheless can suffer or benefit from contagion. The reason I mentioned FTX is simply because it is a very high profile problem and collapse.
Totally agree.
That
no
provides
question at all.
Huge motivation for politicians to grandstand and also, in some sincere cases, lobby and push for change that will ultimately affect I would say, if not the majority, a very high percentage of people who hold crypto in one capacity or another, including self-custody. That's why I bring it up, because there are many different species of collapse, many different species of fraudster. And we don't have to go through the list. I mean, there are many other examples outside of FTX, right? And there are very distinct types of problems that can be presented, which includes public perception, which, if that is the constituency of a given politician, then leads to political pressure for various types of change, right? So it's my point was not so much.
I agree, and also like I think that the ways this is the same as the internet are, like the amount of kind of overexcitement, gold rush, etc. In the late '90s, is a very similar thing, and many investors got burned in those days, and
sure.
You and I know a lot of them, and I still work with Ben Adano, and they got burned in the '90s, and they just ran away from the internet for 10 years.
Yep.
And so that same thing will happen today. And
Yep.
I agree with you. 1,000% about that. And I think, to your point, it's probably amplified because certainly we had a big kind of stock market impact with the internet when the .com bubble burst, but the average Lycos user didn't lose a lot of funds, right? You know what I mean? That's what we're talking about here, where imagine if all of the internet users had also, lost a lot of value, and so that's where, politicians look at their constituencies and go, my God, you guys are getting wrecked. It should be you get a wreck guy, you get a wreck guy, no, I'm just joking, but, but it's not, it's look, I've got to protect you. That's my job as a politician. This to me though, is where what Balaji talks about becomes, quite real. I think the way that he puts it, that we're moving from God to state to network is true. It'll take the next, 25 to, years or longer to play out, just like, the internet has played out over the last 25. But I think over that time horizon, that's more what I'm thinking about is, over that time horizon, my opinion is that your passport becomes a digital document. And the way that you move borders is you show that you are the owner of the wallet that contains that document. And by the way, that wallet is easy to use, just the same way that dial-up was incredibly hard to use in 1995, but it's non-existent today. And I always use the example that I remember ripping compact discs at the DOS command line, right? And now when I say, hey Siri, play some Beatles, the Beatles pops out of my phone, right? It's so that's what happens, but it does take 25 years. So
yeah,
my phone is actually trying to play the Beatles.
Yeah, I would say just if you don't mind, just I'll
please.
Feather in a few things. So the first would be the most exciting potential use cases that I've been able to think of, and I mean a lot of them are going to be skeuomorphic, to use a really fancy term, borrow from Chris Dixon, but is along the lines of what you described. Passport. Certainly, as someone who tends to get injured a lot because I push my body too hard, medical records. Like if the amount of money I would pay to not have to fill out the same damn intake form every time I go to the doctor.
It's a great example.
Would be that is a huge opportunity for anyone who can crack that even partially.
Every time you go, when I go skiing and I drop off my kid and I'm like, oh yeah, okay, let me tell you my life story and sign away my life.
All that stuff. So those are, and then we get into other high transaction cost purchases or sales, which I think will be another area of great opportunity. And it'll take time, but if we're looking at cars, if we're looking at real estate, that will take a very long time. And I will say in part, not because it's technically difficult to address, but I do think some of the Web3 idealists underestimate the power and stick-to-itiveness of incumbents. So, for instance, any state government, and by state it could mean state level, but could mean federal, will not go quietly into the night. And the people with guns in jails ultimately have tremendous power, and I don't think anyone who wants a sort of tribal, pseudo anarchy has actually lived under any of those conditions. And it's certainly difficult to execute well. I haven't seen many examples. And the reason I bring this up is that just like when you're developing a product, it doesn't have to be Web3. I'm not poking fun at Web3. It could be in anything. Like you pick it, biotech or whatever. There's a tendency to look at the toolkit that is available in biotech, Web3, and what has been done in Web3, biotech, whatever. And that underestimates not just what you can transpose or borrow from other areas and use effectively in your domain, but it also underestimates the interconnectedness, right? So I think many people have wanted crypto to act as this counterbalance to market forces that are otherwise outside of their control, maybe to have it act as a hedge. But the larger the adoption, the more institutional players, right? So it's people want in some cases opposing goals, or they want opposing outcomes. Like they want mainstream adoption because hopefully that means that prices go up and A, B, and C happens. While at the same time, in order for that to happen, you have larger and larger players, and they are looking at a portfolio of assets, including crypto. And if crypto it can be bought or sold 24/7 and is highly liquid, and that's not even counting derivatives or other types of sort of synthetic instruments that are laid on top of crypto, they will affect the market. And what that means is their actions will matter in most success cases for crypto. And what affects their behavior is committees and boards of directors and so on, or just people who have a fiduciary responsibility to track public sentiment and other things, political movements that could take an asset through the floor, right? So there's a lot to keep track of. I don't claim to keep track of it, but coming back to a comment I made earlier, like if there's no self-policing within Web3 or very minimal self-policing and cleanup, somebody else is going to do it. or certainly
Totally
attempt to do
agree
it
with
with
that.
very heavy hands. And
Yeah.
I don't encourage you to fight the government. It
Yeah.
doesn't turn out very well generally.
No, I completely agree with you. I think the thing that I find interesting about this, and there's at two different ends of the spectrum. One Balaji, who you've spoken to many
Yep.
times. Um, I think that his point that the network has already unseated a sitting U.S. president or muted a sitting U.S. president shows that we're on the precipice of some power from the network that sits outside of government. And I think every point you made is valid. I just think that that's actually incredibly interesting, and it does show
agree 100%.
the existing power of a network. I also completely agree with you, and I do think that we're probably heading toward, if you believe what Balaji says, that we're moving from God to state to network, then battles between state and network are inevitable.
Oh, they're coming.
And it sounds science fiction.
No, it's within the next 3 years that's going to happen, I think.
Isn't Anonymous already waging war on Russia? You know what I mean? Like, isn't that a network state versus a nation state? Like, that seems quite close at hand. So I definitely agree with you that the states will not go quietly.
Yeah.
And that will mean a lot of pain. And I'd like to interview Balaji again on this very topic. But I do think that there's another end of the spectrum, and maybe we'll close here because we touched on it a bit earlier, and it's a little more fun. I interviewed recently Yancey Strickler, who has MetaLabel, and we talked about the power of this technology to kind of replace the indie label. It was more than that, but like if we want to again bring it back to something that's like close to the heart instead of maybe a gun to the head, an indie label is a collective of individuals. An independent record label is a collective of individuals after a creative mission. Right. And I think this technology has, incredible power to empower a group of people wherever they are in the world, whatever state they might, be living under, to collaborate and share the value of that collaboration. So I think that we'll kind of run the spectrum from something that, is maybe as quaint as that, but meaningful in the lives of individuals, all the way to, and to me, that is a continuation of what the internet has already done. Like Jeff Jarvis said in 2008, he said that we're moving from a mass market to a mass of niches. And to me, that's very much in line with, Balaji's view of the network state, but Balaji's taking it all the way to when that becomes government. I'm much more in the, like, when that forms a band. That's more where, where I live. And, maybe, both things happen over time, but, one involves guns and jails, and the other one, involves, guitars and Ableton. I don't know.
Yeah. More fun to spend time in the latter, which is also, it's like Web3 is a scary place right now for most people. And
Totally.
There are many ways you can lose your shirt or worse. Right. And
yep.
So I think within that chop, there is a lot of opportunity. And I hope people will study history, right? Study, if you find it interesting, some geopolitics, right? Study what has happened in Argentina over and over and over again. And don't just take the index card version and leap to the conclusion that crypto will fix all of it, because I don't necessarily think that's true. There are more lessons you can take. And I used to live in Argentina, so I can speak to this. But study collapses, study the rise and fall of leaders. And also on the fun side, right, look at technologies that have battled and where the victors are not always the best technology. Right, VHS Betamax, if I want to really age myself. There's so many elements that go into mass adoption, and a lot of them are non-obvious to the general public. So study the rise, and I know this might sound silly, but like study the rise and fall of Atari, right? Look at some of these that are actually fun to go back and learn about.
TCP/IP was not necessarily the critic's choice.
Yeah. There's so many
but
examples.
It changed humanity.
Yeah, there's so many examples. And for people who are just like, all government's bad, let's not forget that they gave us the internet. If you want to study innovation, actually, people should take a very close look at DARPA. That's just a side note. I mean, one of the most incredible innovation track records of any organization in world history. So I'm excited about it. Yeah.
It's a great point. It's a great point. I think, you know, this is why I actually think that Balaji's take on it is quite cogent because he has studied history,
Yep.
right? And he is thinking about DARPA in a way, right? Like, what does the DARPA of the future look like, or where does it come from, right?
Yeah.
And you know, there might be a moment when, and actually, I think you'll enjoy. I'll send to you my interview with Yancey because I think you'll enjoy it. He talks about
please.
what he thinks the earliest meta label was, and the answer to that is actually
cool.
Is actually quite interesting. You know, but I agree with you, and I think, you know, I read this paper in college that was what was it called? Night as Frontier. And it was a sociology study about how they were comparing nighttime to Wild West. The idea was we've explored a lot of our spatial territory. So what if we go into this temporal territory, right? And they were saying that nighttime has a lot of the same characteristics as the Wild West, right? You're more likely to strike up a conversation with the person behind the counter at the grocery store. You're also more likely to get shot. Right. You know, if you drop your wallet on the street, it's actually more likely to be returned at night. They were showing this paper, but I do think that this literally is the Wild West. There's a reason that they call it the Wild West, right? Because in a way, you're going to make some of the tightest friendships you've ever made if you're in this space, right? At the same time, to your point, you could lose much more than your shirt, right? And you know, and just like Las Vegas, I feel like, you know, sometimes I'm like, yeah, I'm just going to spend a little money and experiment in NFTs. And that's like saying, I'm just going to take, you know, a little bit of money to Vegas and just experiment and see what happens. You know, I know what's going to happen when I go to Vegas, you know, and maybe I should know what's going to happen when I play here too. But, you know, you always think you're smarter than the slot machine, right? So I think your points are exactly correct, and people do need to hear them. I think, you know, and I said this to Gary Vee when you know, we were like standing at the top of VCon and like looking out over all the 15,000 people who were at VCon, and I said, "Do you feel like you're bringing people to America 300 years ago? You know, like, it is unquestionably the land of opportunity, and a lot of them are going to die of dysentery, right? Use the Oregon Trail.
Yeah, watch 1883.
Right?
You're all sitting out on the Oregon Trail. Ain't going to be easy. And I'm really excited about the space.
Both things are true.
Yeah, both are true. And I think in the meantime, you know, coming back to the fiction question and other things, I'm deciding in what capacities I want to engage and just setting rules for myself that I'm going to follow personally for enjoyment, also for safety, right? I think a lot of folks out there who talk about wrench attacks have never actually had physical threats, right? Like, I've had bomb threats, I've had stalkers, I've had to have police and FBI involved because of literal people who've said, I'm going to come to like South by Southwest and shoot you. When it gets concrete, your life changes dramatically. Side note, also innovation from sort of military government. If you want a good off-label use of really good night vision goggles, take them out and look at the stars. You can see everything. So that's just non-weaponized use of night vision goggles. But the point is, there's a lot of fun to be had. There are a lot of bad actors. It's got to get cleaned up one way or the other, so people can kind of choose, like, do it ourselves or have external forces try to do it for us. And I am very excited because of the Wild West aspect of the rules, so to speak. Like, there are certain technical limitations and things that are permissible or possible. But within that, I will say, just to hopefully start to wrap up on a more optimistic, less gun to the head note, that humans cohere to dogma very, very quickly. And it's like every 3 months, you know, a project must do this and can't do that and must do that. And I'm like, where do these 10 commandments come from? Like, humans really, really, really love 10 commandments. Most of the time, they can at least be stress tested. And in some cases, they're completely false. Like, there's no evidence to really strongly support this dogma. So I would just encourage people, experiment. Like, figure out fast, low-cost ways to do things that seem absurd, not criminal, but just out of the box. And every once in a while, they work. And then 5 years later, people are going to say, oh, of course, that was obviously the right thing to do.
Exactly.
But at the time, it's going to seem fucking nuts.
It's new technology. New technology like this is a creative tool. It's why I loved working with the Beastie Boys for as long as I did, because their MO was always abuse the canvas, right? And it didn't matter if that canvas was a record or an album cover or a music video or a live show or a magazine, or abuse the canvas. And like to me, that's what's exciting. That's why I love the irreverence. It's why I love that, the aspects of what you're doing, from the fiction to the storytelling to the irreverence, to the charitable side of it. I think that's a great place to end on. Thank you for giving me so much time. I super appreciate it.
Oh, wow. This was fun for me. Thank you.
Anytime. Cool.
Yeah.
Well, anytime. I'd love to do it again. And have a great time wherever in the world you are.
Yeah, thanks very much. And I'll say, just as a teaser, this entire thing with CockPunch, and people can just find it, cockpunch.com, at CockPunch on Twitter and wherever else. But the project is a Trojan horse for a bunch of fun stuff, and that will be forthcoming. And the surprises are part of the payoff, right? But what is obvious about your project does not have to be the primary driver for your project. And so I encourage people to think about that as well. Like, how do you master? How might you operate more like a stage performer or a magician or an illusionist who uses very specific reveals over time to tie things together that are separated by time or space? And that sounds lofty and strange, perhaps, but you can make the absurd also a vehicle for things that are serious or philosophical. You can do a lot with it. And the trick is not the trick, but the prerequisite is attention, right? And you can use whatever is necessary, within the bounds of law and ethics, to get that attention. And then what you do with it, that's a separate question. And in a sense, it's a separate part of the design process for me. So I'm having fun. Thanks for the time, man. I appreciate it.
I appreciate it. No, and I love that. I love the tease there at the end. One thing I feel like I've discovered in life, and not only in Web3, is that aesthetics and value are uncorrelated, but distribution and value appear to be correlated. So to your point about attention, you get that attention, and now what will you do with it? Yeah. We shall see. Let's do this again in a year at least. And if we have a chance to do something together sooner, I'd appreciate it.
Yeah, for sure, man. Let's break bread and have some wine in person.
Perfect. All right, man. I'll see you soon. Thanks, Tim.
This content is provided for informational purposes only and is the sole expression of our opinion, and should not be relied upon as legal, business, investment, or tax advice. Do your own research. Any loss or profit is your sole responsibility. Stay safe.